In 1914, Ulster Protestants prepared to fight a British government that wanted to put them under an Irish national parliament in Dublin. Their leader, Edward Carson, brought the United Kingdom to the verge of civil war, summoning Ulster Protestants to defy the law and march against the Act of Parliament that would put them under Dublin. It was the climax to 30 years' opposition to the idea of Home Rule, to 300 years' repetition of the old cry, "No surrender." "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right," was the slogan. But it was, at the very best, highly debatable that Ulster would be right. Nearly 30 years before, the Prime Minister, Gladstone, had been converted to Home Rule for all Ireland by the simple electoral fact that the voters in all Ireland had voted overwhelmingly for Home Rule. He replied to Ulster Protestant opposition of his day with total confidence when he introduced the first Home Rule Bill of 1886 into the House of Commons.
I cannot conceal my conviction that the voice of Ireland as a whole is constitutionally spoken. I cannot say it is otherwise when 5/6 of its lawfully chosen representatives are of one mind on this matter. I cannot allow it to be said that a Protestant minority in Ulster or elsewhere is to rule the question at large for Ireland. I'm aware of no constitutional doctrine tolerable on which such a conclusion could be adopted or justified.
A very different approach from that of British governments here at Westminster today, which guarantee the right of the Protestant minority in Ulster to special consideration for as long as they want it. This guarantee is the end product of a historical process that began with Ulster opposition to this first Home Rule Bill. Not that Ulster opposition was really necessary with this bill. It was known in any case that the House of Lords would throw it out, quite apart from which Gladstone couldn't even get it through the House of Commons. Part of his own Liberal Party, frightened that Home Rule would mean Ireland's separation from Britain, split away and voted with the Conservatives, and the first Home Rule Bill was lost on its second reading here in the House of Commons by 30 votes.
Gladstone's Liberal government resigned, and the defeat of the first Home Rule Bill was duly celebrated in the streets of Belfast by Protestants who'd already been making clear to their Catholic fellow workers in the city what they thought of the prospect of Home Rule. Police intervened, and at least 8 people were killed and many injured in the riots. These Protestant workers saw Catholic workers as people who threatened them, as the Catholic majority in Ireland had always seemed to threaten them, only now with Home Rule. The city of Belfast had prospered under the union of Britain and Ireland more than any other city in Ireland. By the 1880s, its population of 250,000 was 20 times what it had been at the beginning of the century. That of Dublin had only doubled. Prosperity had come first from the success of the cotton and then the linen industry. Linen, which had long been an Ulster cottage industry, took full advantage of the British Industrial Revolution, so that by the 1880s it had become one of the major industries of the United Kingdom. Moreover, a new industry had started in the 1850s in the shipyards of Belfast, where revolutionary designs for iron and steel ships had brought shipbuilding to a point where it flourished equally with the linen trade there. Economically, all this differentiated northeast Ulster from the rest of Ireland. But socially, it had an all-important effect too, because the new industries attracted labour into Belfast from the surrounding countryside in large numbers, many of them Catholics, who now formed an indispensable but suspect and vulnerable social quantity in Ireland's one really large and prosperous industrial city. If Belfast could be likened to Derry for the moment, Catholics were within the walls, a threatening nationalist presence against whom Protestant Unionists must be on their guard. When, in 1892, the Liberals again came to power, stronger and certain to get Home Rule through the Commons, Ulster marshalled to meet the threat. It was through the lodges of the Orange Order, founded on Masonic lines nearly 100 years before as an aggressive society for the self-protection of working-class Protestants, but made respectable by an assumption of leadership by the gentry, it was through the Orange Order that the resistance to Home Rule was first organized. Orangemen had been organized against the first Home Rule Bill by a major from the Army Reserve, Colonel Edward Sanderson, a Conservative member of Parliament, and it was then that Lord Randolph Churchill made what was to turn out one of his shrewdest assessments in an erratic political career when he declared, "The orange card is the one to play." By 1892, at a great Unionist convention beside the Botanical Gardens in Belfast, where a special pavilion had been built, Ulster Protestants made clear their implacable stand. "Who is to separate us?" they asked. And to the 12,000 delegates filling the hall, the cry went out, "We will not have Home Rule." "In the last resort," cried a speaker, "we will be prepared to defend ourselves." And he was cheered to the echo. One resolution threatened violence and bloodshed unknown in that century, though Colonel Sanderson declared in the House of Commons that it was inconceivable that the British Army would fight Ulstermen. In the Commons, the second Home Rule Bill was hotly disputed by Unionists arguing that the tyranny of a parliamentary majority would be as bad as the tyranny of kings, and that what was justifiable against a tyrannical king was justifiable against a tyrannical parliamentary majority. "Come weal, come woe," cried the Orangemen of Belfast. "We will stand by the Union if we have to fight again the Battle of the Boyne." In spite of the heat generated, the second Home Rule Bill was passed through the House of Commons by a majority of 36. It was taken to the House of Lords, where it was firmly rejected, as everyone had known it would be. In Southern Ireland, the news of the second Home Rule Bill's rejection was received with equanimity.
You might think that with this rejection for the second time of Home Rule, this rejection by England of what had been hailed on all sides in nationalist Ireland as a pact of peace between England and Ireland, you might think that here in the south, something like a war would break out, at least politically. Not a bit of it. Not only was there no sort of shot fired, but for 17 years now, Irish political life for the majority of the Irish people enters a sort of doldrums on the national issue. Great reforms are carried out from Westminster, for instance, by the Local Government Act of 1898. Democratically elected county councils were set up in Ireland for the first time, taking local administration out of the hands of those solely with property. But the issue of Ireland a nation, the phrase is mouthed by politicians from time to time, this issue withdraws to the back of the political stage. For 17 years now, there's no Home Rule Bill. Not that there isn't activity by nationally minded Irishmen, But while they leave routine political life to the routine politicians, they embark on national activity of a different sort.
This was an Irish consciousness that sidestepped politics altogether, finding in Irish popular tradition, and particularly in the popular tradition of Irish culture, Irish music, and the Irish language, a new inspiration for Irish awareness and Irish pride. The Irish language was at the heart of this new movement. Conscientious students went to native Gaelic-speaking parts of the West to learn it. For too long it had been neglected, even despised.
The attitude to it then, I'm talking about in the 90s now, was that it was the poor man's language, the fishermen and a few people like that spoke it, and so they did. I remember once, though, when I was only 12, slipping into a pub in that area, and there was nothing but Irish being spoken, and that reminded me very much. But however, it didn't occur to me at that time that it was of any political importance at all. It was just something. A country that hasn't a language of its own can't call itself a nation. And the idea was that the places with home rule and all that sort of thing, let's become an Irish-speaking place, and nobody will say that we're West Britons.
Now a new pride, a new joy, a new sense of self-respect was being found in the language by the young of a class that had long grown away from it, but had now become fed up with sterile politics. What might once have been political meetings were now given Gaelic poetry instead of political cliches.
The Barshing, Augustus, a Solis through Hjaunard, Vrien, Bagangan of Horus, is some Doholistig Fania.
These Irish men and women could now be respectable, not just by aping Anglicised standards, but by responding to different Irish standards of their own. The Anglo-Irish poet W.B. Yeats had already shown a passionate interest in Irish literature and Irish folk tales expressed in English translation. But it was another collector of folk tales, Douglas Hyde, who, speaking and reading Irish himself since boyhood, did more than anyone else at this time to encourage a self-consciously Irish rather than an Anglicised approach to life in Ireland, hoping, rather optimistically as it turned out, to drive out what he called West Britanism from Irish life. In 1893, Hyde helped found the Gaelic League to revive the Irish language and Irish culture and to be quite apart from politics.
In den aul a chassilehe gommersen, dershi gena farsente, agus dinich an aul.
By 1906, the Gaelic League had 900 branches all over Ireland and a membership of 100,000. It had introduced the teaching of Irish into 3,000 schools, and with its language classes, its music and poetry festivals, its summer schools, it could reasonably claim, as one observer did for it, that it was the only national university that Ireland had. But of course, in encouraging Irish consciousness, in conditioning people to think of themselves and look at themselves as Irish, it was creating a mood and an attitude that could one day be very easily turned into a political one. And in spite of the Gaelic League's own disavowal of politics, there were already those who, in tune with this Irish Ireland movement, wanted to create a new political mood too.
Among such was Arthur Griffith, who, from being a member of the Celtic Literary Society, started his own newspapers. The United Irishman, in which he at first combined Irish Ireland thinking with emotive thoughts of the rebellion of 1798 and the Fenians, and then Sinn Féin, meaning self-reliance or we ourselves, which Griffith also used for a new small political grouping he headed, but which had no real political success. Sinn Féin lost at North Leitrim, the only by-election it fought, with its candidate Dolan heavily defeated. Another very different sort of man, also from the Irish Ireland movement, was Patrick Pearse, a great enthusiast for the Irish language and supporter of the Gaelic League, who started a school at St Enda's, Rathfarnham near Dublin, where pupils were not only taught in Irish, but indoctrinated with a dreamy yet purposeful view of some of the most violent events in Irish history.
He never preached violence per se, but he always did preach tones dictum, to break the connection with England. That is my life's endeavour. He always said that there was never a generation of Irishmen that hadn't risen in arms against the oppressors.
And a new generation was now being taught by Pearse and by others in a new nationalist Boy Scout organisation, the FINA, that they had inherited the duty to rise one day for Ireland. While within the Gaelic League, the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood now fostered a nationalist spirit rather at variance with the original, sober, non-political aims of its founders.
The Gaelic League and the Gaelic Athletic Association were great fountains of supply for the new members for the Irish Republican Brotherhood. I joined the Gaelic League when I was about 7 or 8 years of age and kept up contact all through. And through the Gaelic League, of course, I got in touch with some of the IRB men.
I had been thinking rather deeply about it and reading about it and listening to Pearse in his nightly talks to us about Irish history. And I decided to join the IRB, and I was duly sworn in by Pearse.
But extreme nationalism was the pursuit of only a tiny minority in Ireland. For the ordinary Irishman of that day, such concerns were remote, irrelevant, even absurd. His concern was the land, on which a different sort of revolution had been happening. Tenant farmers at last becoming owners of the land they worked. 2 British Acts of Parliament in 1903 and 1909 had much extended the procedure by which the state bought out landlords and gave fair, long-term mortgages to tenants. A growing content in the countryside made it easier for most Irishmen to wait patiently for the day when Home Rule would once again be politically feasible. But there wasn't much social content among the ordinary people of the towns, particularly not among the working classes of Dublin, over half its population. Dublin in 1913 had some of the worst slums in Europe, mostly tenement houses in which 1/3 of the inhabitants lived 6 to a room, with 1 outside tap and 2 outside lavatories for 90 people. The death rate in Dublin was higher than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Poverty is so general that it was taken for granted as a normal way of life.
We lived all together by courtesy of the pawn shop and the Jewish community. Our mothers, who could have been ministers of finance for any country in the world, managed to juggle affairs. Saturday and Sunday were the days you definitely got a cooked meal. On Saturday, it would be everything friable, black and white pudding, sausage, bacon, anything you can get into a frying pan, we would have that. And on Sunday, it was usually pig's cheek and cabbage. Then the rest of the week would be bread, margarine, tea.
It was against such a background that an Irish labour movement was, by 1913, still having to protest its right to be recognised in trade unions. And the man who, at public meetings, everyone wanted to hear, was the man who'd organised the Irish trade union movement. A Liverpool Irishman, James Larkin, an egocentric, restless man with a passionate concern for Ireland's poor.
He was a big, strong-voiced man, and he used to wave his arms around and emphasise what he'd be doing, you know, that type of way. And he'd impress you, and he'd say to you, get up off your knees and stand on your feet. You know, he'd put life into you.
At the same time, he preached the nationalism of the United Irishmen and Emmet, calling for discipline and crying, "There is a great dawn for Ireland." In identifying nationalist aspirations with those of the working class, Larkin poured contempt on those capitalist parliamentary nationalists who, he said, would have the working classes even more at their mercy under Home Rule. And in 1913, he and his lieutenant, a Republican socialist Irishman from Edinburgh, James Connolly, found themselves in conflict with capitalist Home Rule class interests in the shape of the Dublin Tramway Company, which used police and military to lock out all workers after a strike for union recognition. Larkin called a big Sunday meeting in O'Connell Street, and when the police banned it, he reminded his workers of an old United Irishman song about meeting with pikes on their shoulders. "I ask you to meet me in O'Connell Street," he said.
He said, "I'll be there," and the people were there, and he was there, dressed with a big beard, you know. And then when he got up at the window, I'm Jim Larkin, you know, and the crowd cheered.
The cheering was about all they had time for. The police had been waiting in the wings, and after they'd broken into the hotel and arrested Larkin...
The police then started in left, right and centre. You see, the police was reinforced by the Royal Irish Constabulary, and they were big, terrible big men, 6'3" and all up, built in proportion, and it's brutal.
An eyewitness described how there was a continual rapping of batons on people's heads, and how from the shrieks and cries you could tell the same thing was happening all the way down O'Connell Street. The riot was followed by 6 months of bitter, long-drawn-out strike and lockout, during which the police had to be used to escort goods from the docks through the Dublin streets, and the poor suffered appallingly from hunger.
This hunger was going on, it was terrible. And then along came the Countess Margovich.
In the uniform of an Irish citizen army, formed to protect the Dublin workers, the Countess Markovits, born into an Anglo-Irish landed family, married to a Polish count, and dedicated now, with others, to the Dublin poor.
The Countess had fed the people. Dr. Lynn had fed the people. And so had all these ladies. And although they were wealthy people with plenty of money and could have said that lasers with us, they didn't. They threw their weight in behind this scum of the earth, so to speak.
The Dublin strike was broken, and the workers returned without gains. But Larkin's and Connolly's union was not broken as the employers had hoped it would be. The event had so dominated attention in the South that the parliamentary nationalist John Dillon could write in the autumn of 1913 that the Ulster question appeared dim and distant and of minor importance.
Partly, Dillon and other Irish nationalists could think like this because here at Westminster, a Liberal government had by now introduced a new third Home Rule bill, and Irish nationalists were rather letting themselves take Home Rule for granted and assuming that Ulster opposition was mere bluff. They could do this because of what had been happening here on the parliamentary scene. In 1910, 2 general elections gave almost identical results. Liberals and Conservatives equally balanced, with 82 Irish nationalists holding the balance.
The Parliament, opened in 1911 by King George V and Queen Mary, had been a revolutionary one, changing the course of both Irish and English history. In that Parliament, in return for the Irish Party's 82-strong support, the Prime Minister Asquith agreed to introduce this third Home Rule Bill. And with that Irish support, Asquith first abolished the veto of the House of Lords. He did this by threatening to create new Liberal peers to swamp the House of Lords if the Lords themselves didn't accept their loss of power.
It was this removal of the power of the House of Lords that made this third Home Rule Bill quite different from the other two. This time, Home Rule seemed bound to go through, and it was this that set alarm bells ringing in the north of Ireland, in Protestant Ulster. Now, of course, here in the north, alarm bells had rung before at the time of the first two Home Rule Bills. And then there had been a good deal of bluff involved because everyone knew that the House of Lords would reject the bills anyway. Now, though, things were quite different. Now, with the Liberal and Irish majority secure in the House of Commons and the power of the House of Lords removed, Home Rule seemed bound to go through. Now, for Ulster Protestants, the danger of being overwhelmed in a Catholic Dublin Parliament seemed at their door, just as the Catholic rebels had been at their door in the Great Rebellion of 1641, or the Catholic armies of King James II had been at the gates of Derry in 1689. And as Ulster Protestants had said before, and were saying now again, but with a greater purpose and determination than they'd ever shown before, they would not have Home Rule.
For some time now, Orangemen in the north had been parading and drilling, as they were legally entitled to do, to maintain the constitution of the United Kingdom as now established. And for the implacable stand they were now taking, they had found a great leader, a Dublin Unionist lawyer and powerful orator, Edward Carson, who now swore to Ulster Protestants that he would help them put down what he called the most nefarious conspiracy that has yet been hatched against a free people. And he carried them enthusiastically with him as he threatened that they would go beyond the law and take over the government of Ulster themselves.
He seemed to have that power of delivery that infused people with the will to resist.
He was a great leader and he had a great power of a voice. That's what I remember most as a child. This very, very powerful voice and very emotional. He used to kind of end a speech with, "Ulster is written on my heart," and everybody was quite sobby about it, yeah.
And Carson carried not only the Protestants of Ulster with him, but the British Conservative Party. Its leader, Bona Law, came to Belfast and was made welcome because he'd come to offer Ulster Protestants the Conservative opposition's wholehearted and unequivocal support in whatever they might do to resist Home Rule. In England, in the summer of 1912, a great Conservative and Unionist meeting had been held at the Duke of Marlborough's house at Blenheim. At this meeting, Bona Law, the Conservative leader, said he could imagine no lengths of resistance to which Ulster could go in which he would not be prepared to support them. In Ulster, with the backing of the Conservatives and, as he believed, the majority of the British people behind him, Carson was now as confident as he was determined. The slogan of 20 years before was now for real. Ulster would fight, and Ulster, he insisted, would be right. On the 28th of September 1912, Carson and his lieutenant, James Craig, staged a vast and remarkable demonstration at the City Hall in Belfast. A demonstration of their determination to set up a provisional government in Ulster the morning Home Rule passed. Hundreds of thousands of Ulster Protestants came to the City Hall to sign a solemn league and covenant to resist Home Rule. escorted by a guard of honor of 2,500 in bowler hats and carrying walking sticks, Carson himself arrived to be the first to sign. Carson signed with a special silver pen. He was followed by more than 200,000 men, come solemnly to pledge themselves to apply all means necessary to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland, and to reject its authority if it were set up.
Some of the boys were so enthusiastic that they cut their arm and got a bit of the blood out of their arm and signed it with their blood. So that's the sort of man was fighting for Ulster.
It was several days before all those wishing to had signed the covenant, order being kept by marshals of the Ulstermen themselves. Those Ulstermen who'd been drilling had for some time been calling themselves Ulster Volunteers, but they were hardly yet a military force.
They were then drilling with wooden guns, you see, and it was just the ordinary discipline of drills, marching and counter-marching and things like that.
It was more, like a home guard idea. I mean, they had nothing to defend themselves with, really. I mean, they had wooden rifles and hats stuck up at one side with a badge on them.
But if Ulster was really going to fight, it would soon need something more than wooden rifles. Carson came to watch a great parade at Balmoral near Belfast in 1913.
We all formed up and we walked to Balmoral, where the speeches was made, and where a large flagpole was put up. And he unfurled the flag. They said it was the biggest Union Jack ever was made. And there was hundreds and hundreds of Union Jack.
Carson watched 100,000 well-drilled and disciplined men, known now as the Ulster Volunteer Force, march past him, led by, on horseback, a retired Indian Army General, Sir George Richardson. The next important step was to get arms. Arms for men who'd now been drilling for well over a year.
When it was getting very serious, we all formed up in battalions in the different parts of the country and drilled our soldiers. And there was one night we went to the hall, and when we went to the hall, we were told we were confined to barracks for the night. They said there was something happening that wasn't to be divulged.
Now, there had been rumours of gun, but we had no idea what we were going to do that night, although we had a suspicion.
And we weren't told until we paraded that night at 7 o'clock on the Friday night, the 24th of April, 1914, what the operation was all about. And we were given the option of falling out if we didn't want to go on with it, you see. But nobody did fall out.
What the operation was all about, what they were being mobilized for, was something coming in from the sea that night. A large consignment of arms and ammunition on board the Clyde Valley, a coal boat, for the Ulster Volunteers. The arms, which had been purchased in Germany, were brought into Larne Harbour on the 24th of April 1914 to the waiting companies of the Ulster Volunteer Force.
Actually, I was in the signalling section of the harbour company of the volunteers, and I was with the chap who sent the message out to the Clyde Valley. She came round the corner, you see, called her up by lamp to tell them that everything was in order and for her to come on in.
Over 26,000 rifles were loaded onto waiting vehicles.
But there were over 800 vehicles that night passed through Larne. And as far as the police were concerned, they made no attempt to interfere.
The Ulster Volunteer Force was now a formidable army. 100,000 men, many of whom were now well armed and more determined than ever to resist any British government attempt to impose a Home Rule Dublin Parliament on Ulster. And the Home Rule Bill was, by the spring of 1914, steadily making its way towards the statute book. Carson was now in a very strong position. His and Ulster's claim was for Ulster to be excluded permanently from Home Rule. The government offered only individual Ulster counties the right to opt out, and only for a limited time. Carson and his supporters would have none of this. Not that it was going to be rejoicing and plain sailing from now on. For Orange Day 1914, Carson spoke of grim possibilities ahead. The lesson of Larne has taught you what discipline means, what can be achieved. I see no hopes of peace. We must be ready. In my own opinion, Carson told the Ulster Volunteer Force, the great climax and great crisis of our fate cannot be delayed for many weeks, when we shall have once more to assert the manhood of our race. He had his own army and a provisional government prepared to take over Ulster as soon as Home Rule became law. In trust, it was said, for the Constitution of the United Kingdom. In fact, there had been no such naked threat to the Constitution of the United Kingdom for nearly 3 centuries.
What would the British government do? Well, of course, it had its own much more powerful force, the British Army, a substantial part of which was in 1914 stationed here on this windswept plain in the middle of Ireland, the Curragh in County Kildare. But a few weeks before the Larne gun running, something had happened here which put at risk the whole ability of the British government to enforce the law against Ulster Protestants in Ireland. The officer class in the army at that time were a conservative lot and sympathetic to Ulster Protestants. And the officer in charge here, General Sir Arthur Paget, asking guidance of the War Office on how to act if his officers refused to march against Ulster. An odd question, really. Still, Paget, asking guidance of the War Office, was told that those of his officers who actually lived in Ulster could be allowed just temporarily to disappear, while the rest would be dismissed the service. Whereupon Paget asked his officers outright, would you march against Ulster or prefer to be dismissed the service?
General Sir Hubert Gough of the Cavalry Brigade and 59 of his officers said that if asked this, they would choose to be dismissed the service.
The effect of these events, this incident at the Curragh, followed by the uninterfered with gun running of the Ulster Volunteers at Larne, the effect of these events on Southern Irish nationalist Home Rule opinion here in Southern Ireland can well be imagined. And Southern Irish nationalists now began to look seriously to their own means of defending Home Rule against Ulster.
It was being realized now that it would no longer be enough for Home Rule leaders, men like John Redmond and John Dillon, simply to make the sort of powerful Home Rule speeches they'd been making for years, though they did continue making them, agreeing only to a temporary exclusion of some Ulster counties from Home Rule, a concession which Ulster would have nothing to do with. Nationalists had already started their own volunteers the year before.
We met in Wynn's Hotel in Abbey Street. There were several committee meetings, first of all, and then we decided to hold a recruiting meeting, and we selected for that purpose the enormous skating rink, at the Rotunda Gardens. We had an overwhelming crowd of putative volunteers, and we had ready for them forms which they would sign with their address and so on, so that they could be put into companies and eventually into brigades.
About this same time, a small workers' citizen army was formed, distinct from the volunteers and imbued with the extreme nationalism of Larkin and Connolly, but primarily there to protect working class interests. The Irish volunteers, with former NCOs of the British Army, had been drilling without arms or with hurley sticks and wooden rifles. Like their Ulster counterparts, to be effective, they needed arms. The actual initiative for the Southern Volunteers had come from the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood, but the vast majority of the volunteers knew nothing of this and joined to strengthen the British government's resolve to put all Ireland Home Rule through. But how were they to get arms? One Sunday, volunteers paraded at Fairview Park from all over Dublin, without knowing what they were parading for.
The order was given then to march, and we set off for Howth, still not knowing where we were going. We arrived in Howth at the end of the quay and took a snack, and then we noticed men coming up from the harbour with rifles. And in turn then we went down and each of us got a rifle, handed up from a yacht lying alongside the wall.
The rifles and their ammunition had been purchased in Germany and brought to Howth with the help of two women friends by the ardent half-English, half-Irish Home Ruler Erskine Childers. Only 1,600 rifles altogether, of which 900 came into Howth this day to be distributed by boys of the National Scout Movement, the FINA, to the waiting volunteers, who then set off with the rifles for Dublin.
It was all right for about 6 miles. We got to Fairview. And Fairview, we came across the end of the street was blocked right across by soldiers, British soldiers, armed, of course. We stood and just looked at one another. Nobody said anything, soldiers or us. Nobody knew. We never entered our head there would be any trouble. And word was passed along to hand back a rifle. And we each handed a rifle back to the next rank, and so on until they were all gone.
The Workers' Irish Citizen Army were that day having a quite separate drill parade at Fairview, and the FINA boys were acting as sentries.
We were on guard around this big hedge while the men were up at the front at the house, the Citizen Army were drilling. And suddenly rifles came through the hedges, thrown into the hedges and over the hedges, and we were around it. And we couldn't realise it.
And the taxi cabs kept coming all night with an armful of rifles. And he threw them on the parlour floor and said, "Molly, hide them." And she went round and put them back at the shutters, the window shutters. And then another load came. This time she had to put them out in the garden along the cabbage rows. And all night long she was hiding guns. And now the next morning we got out and went to work. My brother and sister and myself. And towards evening we were notified. And the Cumann girls, we all joined and we went out on the tram car to Howth. And now we went into the bushes where these men had hidden the guns. And we all found them. And coming back we couldn't sit down the tram car and the conductor was furious because we had a rifle under our coat. And they were heavy German Mauser's.
The soldiers who'd tried but failed to disarm the volunteers, a detachment of the King's Own Scottish borderers, had got back to Dublin and marched towards their barracks down a street by the Liffey known as Bachelor's Walk.
There was about, say, between 20 and 30 soldiers. They were marching 4 deep, and there was a crowd after them, boys and youngsters throwing missiles at them like that. And one person made an attempt to take a gun off one of the soldiers at the back. And he held a gun, they wrestled over to the railings to a shop there, a baker, tea shop, and they wrestled, but the soldier won, and then he held a gun like that. a bayonet on it, and he backed into the ranks again. And it was then that the soldiers fired. Then I heard about the woman being shot. And the woman, I knew the woman. Now the woman was in a, there was a steps, a high steps, 1, 2, 3, 4 steps up. She used to stand here selling matches. And she must have went up the steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, for safety at the door. Therefore, she was a target for the soldiers. You understand, fording over the hedge. She was well high up.
Inquests were held on the 3 people killed. 38 were wounded. 1 of them died later. No nationalist could help contrasting what had happened on Bachelor's Walk after 900 rifles had been landed at Howth with the fact that over 26,000 rifles had been landed by Ulster volunteers without the British authorities interfering at all. The victim's funeral in Dublin expressed both sorrow and a powerfully mounting nationalist sentiment that Home Rule was not getting a fair deal. The Irish volunteers, with arms reversed, were prominent in the procession.
It was a terrible day in Dublin. They were crying, sobbing, and they were crying out vengeance on the Scottish borderers. And we just kept marching and praying and crying.
Not only the Irish volunteers were in the funeral procession, but the Countess Markowitz, leading the women's organisation Cumann. After this, there was the feeling in the South that all Ireland Home Rule would have to go through. A few days later, the great European war was to break out and apparently change the situation entirely. An All-Ireland Home Rule Act was passed, but immediately suspended so that the Ulster question could be resolved in less dangerous days for Britain. Most volunteers were to join the British Army to help Britain meet her danger in the hope that she would then keep faith with the Act as passed. But a tiny minority secretly nursed the ancient belief that England's danger was Ireland's opportunity.